now with the passing of the Online Safety Act, as of Monday of this week, which was the 17th of March, there is no free speech. Everything is, whether it's TV, radio, or online content, is now all regulated under Ofcom. You can make lawful comments using your freedom of speech, but if Ofcom find that it is harmful, legal but harmful, causes psychological distress to someone else, then they can pull that content from the platform. And if you don't remove that content, you can be sanctioned, you can be fined. And that can lead up to 2 years in imprisonment.
Hello and welcome to the Resistance GB podcast. My name's Emma Dunwell and today I'm joined by Norman Richmond, Director of Ofcom Watch. How are you today and thank you for joining me?
Very well. Good to be with Resistance GB.
So could you explain to our viewers what Ofcom Watch is and what it is you guys do?
Yeah, we're a relatively new organisation. We were just founded before the general election last year, and we're providing an oversight to Ofcom, to the Orwellian Office of Communications, which is our state media regulator, but I like to call it our state media censor. And we're providing an oversight. We're providing legal challenges, a series of legal challenges to Ofcom and to their very existence. We're very clear we don't want to reform Ofcom. We want it to be abolished.
So what was the deciding factor that made you think of Ofcom Watch to begin with? Was there one thing that Ofcom did that made that decision?
Yeah, I think the catalyst for establishing Ofcom Watch was, first of all, there was no organisation really independently providing oversight of what Ofcom was doing. And a number of us from across all political parties and no political parties felt that we needed to set up an organisation to do that. And the other catalyst, I guess, was the passing by the Conservative government in 2023 of the Online Safety Act. Because the Online Safety Act basically widened Ofcom's powers, legislative powers, where before they legislated over telecommunications, TV and radio. Now with the Online Safety Act, they have wider powers that basically embrace the whole of online, of social media.
Is this why a lot of Americans are up in arms about this? Because it actually allows Ofcom to dictate what is posted on things like Twitter, which is an international platform.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question. The way to answer that question is to really shows the distinction between America and between Europe and the UK. And the important distinction is, in America, they have the First Amendment. But when it relates to online censorship and online control of free speech, they have reinforced their First Amendment with what they call Section 230, which is part of their Communications Decency Act, which was passed way back in 1996. But basically Section 230 gives immunity to content providers. So if you're Elon Musk at Twitter, if you're YouTube, if you're Resistance GB or GB News broadcasting, you don't have that First Amendment Section 230 immunity. You are actually liable. You're treated as a publisher, and you're liable for the people that are using your platform for what they say. And that's the distinction. In America, there genuinely is free speech. And Twitter, X, their television companies, their radio, their podcasting companies have freedom of speech. I can say something on your platform and not be censored by a state regulator in the US. But in UK and in the EU, we can. The Online Safety Act treats online platforms as publishers. And in Europe, in the EU, they have the Digital Services Act. But in my opinion, the Online Services Act is far more draconian in terms of its penalties.
Right. So do you
Yeah.
think it was a disguise to just prohibit more things that were harmful but not illegal, so to speak?
Well, that's it. That's exactly what Section 10 of the Online Safety Act allows for. You can make lawful comments using your freedom of speech, but if Ofcom find that it is harmful, legal but harmful, causes psychological distress to someone else, then they can pull that content from the platform. And if you don't remove that content, you can be sanctioned, you can be fined. And that can lead up to 2 years in imprisonment for the person actually making the speech, and huge fines for the content provider.
So where is the line drawn with things like this? Because you can't police necessarily what offends someone, what offends
Yeah.
me does not offend you. Where does the line get drawn?
Well, that's the point. The point is that it's entirely legally, it's subjective. So when you go to the High Court, you're actually, Ofcom will have to argue that, you know, they're following their statutory regulations, their guidelines that interpret the law, and it's totally subjective, because I can make a false statement now, but you might perceive it as a false statement, but in 2 days' time or in 2 weeks' time, that false statement actually could become fact.
Yeah.
So it's totally subjective. And that's where I think legally Ofcom and the government is going to be open to huge legal challenge.
So would you be able to give us some examples of the things that Ofcom might deem as legal but harmful?
Well, we don't even need to try and predict the future. What we can do is look at how the EU have enforced the Digital Services Act. Last year we had the European parliamentary elections across the EU, obviously not in the UK because we had Brexit, so we're not part of that. But do you know how many YouTube videos that the EU actually took down during the period before, during the European elections? It was 35,000 YouTube videos were removed not because they were full of harmful content. It was subjective by the EU that they didn't like they just simply didn't like the content of many of these videos, and we're talking 35,000. To make a legal challenge on 35,000 videos coming down, that's a massive piece of work.
Yeah.
So it just shows you how sophisticated their whole sort of censorship complex is in the EU, and I can see in Ofcom now having similar, if not actually more draconian powers, that they will be removing literally, tens of thousands of videos from YouTube, potentially taking down lots of posts across all of social media. They will have the powers to do that, and they will be backed up by the courts. They will be backed up by legal sanctions, up to 2 years in imprisonment. And for content providers, fines of 10% of their global revenue, up to a maximum fine of £18 million. So that's an incentive for content providers actually to self-censor, and that's where I have a concern. Not that Ofcom will overreach; they will overreach their powers, but it's the effect, the chilling effect that this legislation has on content providers actually self-censoring. So free speech itself is going to be suppressed.
Wow. There's a gloomy outlook. Do you think that that's a similar situation to what's happened? I mean, you mentioned before GB News. Obviously, could you explain to everyone what happened with Mark Stein and censorship with Ofcom and GB News?
Yeah, Mark Stein, Canadian journalist with 40 years plus credentials across journalism. He had his own show on GB News. He interviewed an American commentator, Dr. Naomi Wolf, very well-known person in the United States. They were discussing vaccine harms, vaccine injuries as a result of the COVID-19 vaccine rollout. And first of all, I think really GB News didn't support their own journalist. They required him to sign a non-disclosure agreement, providing them with immunity if Ofcom came after him in the future. He refused to sign that NDA, quite rightly. So GB News fired him, effectively. It was a constructive dismissal. And Mark then challenged, because the beginning of all of this was that Ofcom had launched an investigation into his programme, potentially going to sanction GB News. And Mark took Ofcom to the High Court in London for a judicial review hearing. It was only a one-day hearing. I attended that hearing with Mark and with Dr. Wolf, both of whom I know. And unfortunately, the High Court judge found against Mark Stein and in favour of Ofcom. So Ofcom's sanctions were upheld in that case. So that was under current legislation, not now the Online Safety Act. With the Online Safety Act, they could literally take down that content and stop GB News from publishing it and sanction them for doing so. And also, in addition, they could potentially fine and imprison Mark Stein.
Now, am I right in thinking that Mark Stein is vaccine injured himself?
I'm not sure about that. I know that Mark is in not the best of health. He's suffered a couple of heart attacks, but as far as I understood, that was through the stress of the situation he was going through, rather than being vaccine injured. I'm not sure about that.
Still, it doesn't exactly speak highly of the way that they treat their employees, either past or present.
No, GB News have. I mean, if you make a list just since their founding, I think it comes up to over 40 journalists within GB News that have been removed.
Yeah, well, there's Dan Wootton on YouTube who's very vocal about the issues within GB News. With Ofcom, it seems that they target certain political views. So it's a running trend of particularly right-wing news outlets. It seems that the BBC can get away with just about anything. Why is that?
Well, I mean, I think it's fairly obvious. That's why we're not looking to reform. We're not a campaign to reform Ofcom. We don't believe that Ofcom can be reformed. We don't think it should exist in the first place. And the reason that they have what I think is an institutional bias is because it's a revolving door at Ofcom. It's a revolving door of ex-BBC executives, ex-Sky News, ex-ITV and Channel 4 executives going from one TV channel into Ofcom, one becoming a regulator one day, being a broadcaster the next. There is an institutional bias there. It's a London metropolitan sort of bubble mindset that they have. And if you look at the metropolitan sort of bubble, it usually is a sort of liberal left, and it's against small c sort of conservative or right wing views that are expressed. So ultimately, Ofcom itself is institutionally biased. Its judgments are anonymous, which is a democratic outrage. You don't actually have transparency within Ofcom, so they can literally do what they want internally and sanction broadcasters without any democratic accountability.
So who is actually running it then? Because they seem, like you said, they seem to just be completely out of control. There's no regulation of it whatsoever.
Well, there is. They would argue that there is accountability through the fact that they're set up by statute, by Parliament. So ultimately, they would be responsible to the DCMS, the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, and to the Secretary of State there. But if their chief executive, Dame Melanie Dawes, appears more than twice, more than 3 times in front of Parliament in any calendar year, I would be surprised. That's not accountability. In front of a committee, answering prepared questions with pre-prepared answers. That's not democratic accountability.
What do you think this says about where this country's going in regards to news and what the government would deem suitable for citizens to know?
Well, with the passing of the Online Safety Act, as of Monday of this week, which was the 17th of March, there is no free speech. Everything is, whether it's TV, radio, or online content, is now all regulated under Ofcom. If Ofcom target you, as they have been targeting GB News particularly, but they could come after Resistance GB. We hope not. But they now can do that. They have the regulatory powers to do it, and they have the sanctions that will put the fear amongst content providers. You can see how GB News has transformed from its founding as being, branding itself as the home of free speech. But they're not the home of free speech. They're self-censoring. They have censored their own journalists. They have fired their own journalists for overstepping the mark on free speech. So I don't think you can say that GB News is the home of free speech. The BBC certainly isn't. The BBC is part of the state apparatus and parrots exactly what the government wants to do, and you can see that in evidence during the 2 years of lockdowns during COVID.
So the Online Safety Act actually has some interesting loopholes. If I could just read them out, I've got them noted down. So in Section 17, it must protect content that has democratic importance. It has the duty to protect news publisher content and a duty to protect journalistic content. So does that mean that there are certain protections when it comes to Ofcom regulations?
Frankly, I don't believe so. I think these sections have been introduced into the bill to give Ofcom political cover. In the same way, what they're doing in terms of protecting child sexual exploitation, these are good things. But I have to ask myself, is Ofcom the regulator to stop that when there's existing laws in place? I believe that they're using these sections just as political cover, because you have to do that in a democracy. Government can't put up Ofcom, as Tony Blair did in establishing Ofcom in 2003 as a state regulator, if it's not defending free speech. But it's what they do in practice that counts. And in practice, what Ofcom is doing is regulating free speech. Whatever the sections are, whatever the exceptions are, they are regulating free speech. And our contention is that they shouldn't exist in the first place. They should be defunded by a new, if it's a reform, if it's a populist nationalist government, on day one, Ofcom should be one of the 500 plus quangos that should be immediately defunded and then abolished. We don't have a state regulator for newspapers. Newspapers have IPSO. They have their own voluntary code. And in a democratic society, that works. And why we have a state regulator for TV, radio, and now online, and it will go further. Once you give powers to a quango, to an unaccountable, democratically unaccountable quango, they will use these powers, and they will try and get more powers. So our argument is abolish them completely. And our campaign is on that focus. We will use every legal device. We will use every legal challenge against Ofcom to expose their censorship and make sure that there is a political momentum behind their abolition.
Do you think that there's a certain favoritism going on, even within certain news outlets? I'm choosing GB News because we've mentioned it a few times. Obviously, Mark Stein was not kind of looked after well once he started to push back against the vaccine narrative. But there's another presenter, Bev Turner. Now, she frequently disparages the vaccine rollout and, kind of says it how it is, quite frankly. Why do you think it is that some people seem to get away with it and others don't?
I don't think she does, but I mean, let's be clear. Let me just go back to your comments about Mark Stein. Mark Stein's career was ended brutally. I mean, he cannot work in the UK. He cannot broadcast in the UK. His reputation was, mortally damaged. He now, I mean, he's Canadian. He lives in Canada. He can still operate internationally, but in the UK, he's been completely shut down. His reputation has been completely destroyed. Bev Turner, she gets away, doesn't get away with it, but under Ofcom rules, all you have to do is provide balance. So, as long as her co-host, who I think is Andrew Pierce, as long as he counterbalances what she says, then Ofcom is fine with it. There's seen to be balance. That's why I call all TV in the UK TV for stupid people. Because, for example, I've been invited onto GB News, I've been invited onto Channel 4 and onto BBC. I routinely refuse to be interviewed by any of the legacy mainstream media because I know all they will do is put me in a studio with another person providing completely the opposite point of view. So it becomes a Punch and Judy, a pantomime show, and you don't really engender debate there. You don't get into the real detail of issues. So that's why I don't do interviews with TV for stupid people.
Fair enough. With obviously the setting up of Ofcom Watch, do you think that the pressure that's over freedom of speech at the moment in this country is the most important issue that's going on at the moment?
Yeah, I think without freedom of speech, all the other rights fall into absolute irrelevance. I mean, I think the great sort of Dr. David Starkey sort of really articulates that very, very eloquently. Because if you don't have free speech, what's the point of having a vote at a general election when the politicians are scared themselves to express what they really want to say? I mean, at the moment, we've got absurd situations where the issues that are of absolute crucial importance to the British people are not reflected in Parliament. So issues around immigration, around deportation, around repatriation, politicians are fearful to make comments because they fear that will be closed down. They fear that they're essentially self-censoring themselves.
So what is on the cards for Ofcom Watch at the moment? Anything coming up? Current campaigns or future campaigns?
Yeah, I mean, our current campaign basically is planning to a number of legal challenges against both Ofcom and the BBC. And it will be focusing very much on Ofcom's internal complaints process. We don't believe it's lawful. We don't believe it's fit for purpose. And incidentally, we don't think the BBC's internal complaints process is lawful. It doesn't meet the BBC Charter requirements, and we don't think it's fit for purpose. So we're going to mount a legal challenge in the High Court, focusing specifically on their complaints processes. I don't use their complaints process. Complaining to the BBC is a pointless, fruitless exercise.
Speaking to a wall.
You're wasting keystrokes. You're wasting a first-class stamp if you're still using stamp. It's complete waste of time. And similarly, complaining to Ofcom is a completely pointless exercise as well, because they're all, as I said earlier, it's an anonymous decision-making process that they have. There's no transparency, and they always find in favour of the legacy media. So what's the point?
Defiance Records, bringing you the best music from the movement. Ramisa's Never Give Up and Mad Mix's You're So Right are now available as a double A side on Defiance. And Raw Milk Conspiracy are bringing the purpose back to music with their latest single, This Is England 2024, and their brilliant debut, Misinformation Whore. Plus, now out is the fantastic Ballad of a Toolmaker's Son from Trevor John, all available from Defiance Records, the Freedom label.
Did what he was told to do back then, and that's how he got the number 10.
Speaking of censorship within politics and politicians being frightened to say what's really on their mind, I was hoping we could talk a little bit about reform and all the kind of chaos that's unfolded. Could you just give everyone a rundown of what's happened between Farage and Lowe and just what is going on with reform?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I wear two hats, under sort of Ofcom Watch in terms of the media coverage that the reform sort of implosion, the self-destruction that they're going through as a party. But I'm not a member of reform. I'm not a member of any political party. But I do generally support what I call small c conservative populist nationalist forces within the UK. So I'm sympathetic to the membership of Reform, who clearly are more populist nationalist than the leadership of Reform, and there seems to be a complete disconnection there. And Rupert Lowe, as one of their MPs, their very energetic MPs representing 20% of their parliamentary party, has obviously been treated absolutely outrageously. He's not been proved guilty of any allegations, and these are just allegations, incidentally, that don't even involve him. But unfortunately, the leadership of Reform are using it as a pretext to remove him, to close down his speech. They're closing down the speech of not just Rupert Lowe, but that's the tip of the iceberg across the whole of the country. Reform chairmen, Reform members are being silenced. Candidates are being forced to sign NDAs for the party that is claiming to be pro free speech. They certainly are using a lot of censorship.
Do you know what they are being asked to sign NDAs for? Is there a specific subject that's surrounding? Because I know that there's been a lot of argument between the Reform members when it comes to Tommy Robinson, Stephen Yaxley Lennon. Is that what that's surrounding, or is it a number of different things?
I think there's a number of different things. I mean, I haven't seen the actual NDA. We haven't yet seen it. We will get visibility of what some chairmen and candidates have been asked to sign. But effectively, the NDA puts a control on candidates and on what chairmen can say in terms of their flexibility to do things. So, for example, I was one of the organisers of a meeting over the new year. It wasn't branded Reform UK meeting, but it had members of Reform, it had chairman of Reform involved in the meeting, and we had a speaker, Gwen Towler, who was Nigel Farage's previous media communications director, fired, incidentally, by Zia Yusuf. And we then found out after that meeting that while Gwen Towler was on the Reform approved speakers list, the other speakers attending that meeting and on the platform with Gwen weren't approved speakers. So that revealed the fact that Reform actually have an approved speakers list. So across the country, if you're organising a meeting, you've got to check with the head office of Reform to make sure that the speaker that you have or speakers that you have at a meeting are actually approved beforehand.
Seems
absolutely ridiculous.
Very hypocritical.
In a democratic party. I mean, I don't believe the Labour Party or the Conservatives or the Lib Dems have a similar sanction on their membership, but Reform do, which I think is outrageous. And I think most chairmen are ignoring it, but they're ignoring it at the risk that they will then be fired by the head office.
Do you think that the main issue with Reform at the moment is Farage's leadership or the appointment of Zia Youssef that people seem to be so angry about?
I think both. I think Zia Youssef is clearly being seen as a divisive character within Reform. He doesn't have a popular mandate. The members, the activists, the grassroots activists, they don't know who he is. He was appointed by Nigel from complete obscurity.
I was going to ask, why do you think he is seen as so divisive? Why do you think that is?
I think because he has created, he's suppressed free speech within Reform, number one. He's not allowed free speech to take place. There seems to be areas around discussion on immigration, on the rise of Islam, that are no longer can no longer be discussed, and that includes the issue of Tommy Robinson. You cannot be a supporter of Tommy Robinson or express support for Tommy Robinson and also be a member of Reform, far less a chairman of a constituency branch. That actually Tommy Robinson's name is actually mentioned in the candidates' requirements. Recruitment within Reform. So, I couldn't be a member of Reform. I certainly couldn't stand for the chairmanship or be a candidate for Reform because I'm, a supporter of Tommy Robinson.
Now, the Tommy Robinson stance has not really been anything new. Obviously, we've had a lot of uproar when Tice went on and referred to Tommy Robinson's people as that lot. But in regards to sort of mass immigration and free speech, it seems to be that that's what everyone was hoping for. When Reform kind of burst onto the scene, everyone thought that that's what they were standing for, and then they've just done a complete U-turn. Do you think that, most, if not all, of their support is just going to fall out from under them now?
I don't think there has been a U-turn. I think under the scrutiny of media attention and of delving into actual policy areas, it's one thing being a protest movement and just being able to protest and say we need to leave the EU, we need to stop the small boats. It's different when you then achieve national polling figures, which Reform are now achieving, into the high 20s, taking over from the official opposition. Then there's a level of scrutiny which is actually more serious. What are you going to do when you attain power, or if you have a share in power in government? And that's where Reform have been seen to be lacking, or where Nigel Farage, who literally is the only policy formulator within Reform, whatever he says is the policy of Reform. There's no structured policy formulation body within Reform. It's whatever Richard Tice or whatever Nigel Farage says is policy. It's clearly not Rupert Lowe who's dictating policy. And that scrutiny, I think, now is exposing Reform and is exposing Nigel Farage. Their policy on immigration isn't what the membership thought it was. It certainly doesn't go as far as the membership want. Their policy on Ukraine, on the Russia-Ukraine war, isn't what members thought it was. They thought it was very much like Trump's policy for to secure a peace, not a forever war. And yet Farage and Tice are both supporting Ukraine's continued war. They're even going further. They're doubling down, saying that Ukraine should be a member of NATO. That definitely doesn't reflect the membership of Reform. So they're being exposed.
Do you think the party has got significantly weaker since they parted with members such as Ben Habib, who seem very steadfast in that his position would be to leave the ECHR? Do you think that that's still on the reform to-do list, or do you think that that kind of left?
Well,
with,
I think
with
that is
heavy-
the policy. That is the stated policy of reform. Nigel Farage is on the record just over the last couple of days, saying that that would be the first the first policy decision that he would make if he was Prime Minister. He would immediately leave the ECHR. I don't think that's the issue. The issue is that reform isn't reflecting the views across its members. It's not being seen now to be representative of its own members, and that's where the disconnect is coming in.
Yeah. Well, as well as the actual members inside the party, obviously, with the public, there's been a lot of back and forth with reform and as to their popularity.
Reform are benefiting from the fact that the Labour government is seriously very, very unpopular with the electorate just in the last sort of 8-9 months since they were elected. They're also Reform is also benefiting from the fact that the Conservative Party has completely imploded. Their electoral support has flatlined as well. So when polling organisations are asking voters who they would vote for, Reform as the third alternative is clearly benefiting from that. But as quickly as they are benefiting from that in the national polling, that these leads, these polling numbers could evaporate the minute it comes to a real election, a local election, far less a general election. So it's very positive that the two-party, the uniparty duopoly is being challenged. But what people are now seriously asking is, what's the point of reform if you attain power and then you don't do anything with it?
Yeah.
You then become the Tory party 2.0, and that's the real sort of nub of the issue for a lot of reform members. They didn't join reform to be the Conservative Party 2.0.
Yeah.
They wanted to join reform to create a transformation, a political transformation, in the same way as Donald Trump has transformed the Republican Party. And that's not happening. That clearly is not happening in the UK. Farage is no Trump.
Yeah, I think that's where the public get angry with it as well, because for as long as everyone can remember, it's been Labour versus Conservative, and then all of a sudden Reform burst on the scene.
Yeah.
Where do you see the future of Reform going with all this chaos within the party?
I think if the trajectory of Reform continues the way it is, Reform is finished as a political party, unless, and it's important, unless they democratise the party. I understand there is an initiative, and I know that you might be interviewing one of the people behind this initiative, but there is an initiative across the grassroots of Reform to petition the leadership to democratise the party, and if that puts sufficient pressure on Nigel Farage, and hopefully Zia Yusuf is forced to resign, then I think Reform can be salvaged. There is something to salvage there. There's 5 members of Parliament. They have a parliamentary representation. They have over 210,000 members. They're polling high in the national opinion polls. They're looking good in terms of candidates standing across 1,500 seats in the local elections coming up in May. So there's a core of a new political force that is there 4 years out from a general election. So there's something there that can be saved, but only if Reform democratises itself. It cannot appeal to the voters to become the next government of this country in a democratic election if they're not actually democratic themselves as a party. That's unsustainable. That's not going to happen.
You mentioned a minute ago that Farage is no Trump. Now, this is just my personal opinion, but he seems to kind of fancy himself as the UK version of Trump. And that seems to be why he gained a lot of popularity. His support has kind of gone back and forth with figures like Elon Musk. Elon Musk was very supportive of him, and then again it came to the Tommy Robinson argument, and that kind of went away. Do you think that Farage's popularity is dissipating the longer we go on, or do you think he's gaining popularity?
He's not gaining popularity. I mean, Nigel Farage has always been a Marmite character.
You love him or you hate him.
You know, you either love him or you hate him. For every voter in a poll that says they love Nigel and they love reform, there'll be another voter that says they don't. So, you know, they cancel out each other. The key issue is that Donald John Trump is a populist nationalist. He will say, I am a populist nationalist. People will see that his policy agenda, his executive orders since he's been president, show that he is a populist nationalist. He's closed the border in the United States. He didn't require any new laws to do that. He just enforced the laws that America has. Yeah. And overnight, 95% of the illegal migrant invasion across their southern border in Mexico stopped. Literally stopped. We can do the same, but Nigel Farage doesn't describe himself as a populist nationalist. If you ask Nigel Farage in this studio this afternoon, are you a populist nationalist, Nigel? He will say, no, of course I'm not. And that's the disconnect. And that's where I think Trump, Elon Musk, and people behind these people like Steve Bannon, for example, who knows Nigel extremely well, they're now uncovering the fact, they're exposing the fact that Nigel isn't actually what he was presenting himself as. He's not a populist nationalist, and he actually disagrees with Trump on fundamental policy issues.
Yeah. Well, Rupert Lowe seems to be much more keen on mass deportations than Farage. You know, I mean, Farage seemed to be very much for that idea to begin with, and then again, that's kind of dissipated. Are there any other figures in the UK that you think would have the cojones, so to speak, to carry that action through? I think
Rupert Lowe, you mentioned Rupert Lowe, he is a populist nationalist. You might not understand what that term is. It's an American term, but it's a term, I think, that applies to Rupert Lowe. He would put the country before party. Yeah. He would put the country before ideology. And that's what a populist nationalist would do. Is there other populist nationalists in the UK? Of course there is. I would consider most of the I think you have to make a distinction. The membership of Reform is 210,000 plus members. Many of them aren't political, but the grassroots activists, they are highly political. Yeah. And I would say the overwhelming majority of activists within Reform UK are populist nationalists. And that's why there's open rebellion. There's an open civil war at the moment in Reform, because they've suddenly realised that their chairman, their leadership, their leader, are not populist nationalists. They're not Trump supporters. And that's why there's open rebellion. And as long as that situation remains, Reform is going to have a huge challenge in translating its opinion polling into actual MPs, into actual success as an electoral force.
Yeah. So where can people find Ofcom Watch and the information that you put out?
Best place to find us is on X. We're at Ofcom Commentary. And please come there, like us, follow us, and you'll get an update on all of our campaigns on that timeline feed.
Okay, well, thank you for joining me today. It was lovely seeing you again.
Thanks, Emma. Good to see you.
For more exclusive behind-the-scenes content, please be sure to subscribe to our Patreon. It really helps us cover the cost of any live streams, events, protests, or anything that we do. You'll also be seeing any behind-the-scenes footage and anything that we might be doing with Defiance Records.
Resistance GB's new series, 1,000 Words, has me, portrait artist Jake Fern, talking to some of the key figures in the movement. Half my brain concentrating on having a conversation, and the other half on making a painting. Do I succeed at either? You be the judge.